before we get started, we are in Colossians. We are in the last week of Colossians before next week we move to small groups. And so there's your announcement. Your small groups are starting next week. So we're looking forward to that, excited about that. One other announcement, we have a church retreat that's going to be coming up October 9th and 10th. And so make sure you sign up for that. It's going to be out at Hidden Falls. And so make sure you sign up. It's going to be an excellent time. Depending on who signs up and what, we'll begin to build some activities and things like that. So we would love to have you sign up. Stop by the table. Trent Freed will meet you right outside these doors at the little black table and get you signed up. $30 per adult, $30, and that gets you your room and your food and all the activities. So looking forward to that. Before I jump into Colossians 4, I want to give you a quick summary, maybe just to remind you what we've learned. Maybe you have not been in here the last 3 weeks, and just to kind of catch you up. But chapter 1, Pastor brought kind of opened everything up, and he talked about the supremacy and the sufficiency of Christ. He talked about Christ being supreme, King of all kings, Lord of all lords. He is everything, because there was questions whether Jesus really was who he said he was. There were questions whether Jesus was just another good guy or just another way to get to God. But Paul begins to squash all those thoughts, and he was saying, do you not understand that everything was created by Jesus for Jesus? That there is nothing above Jesus. Nothing above Jesus. He is overall. So he said, he is supreme above everything else. But he also says he is sufficient. He is sufficient, meaning this, that there is everything that Jesus has to offer is enough for you. Everything that Jesus has to offer, everything in the gospel, everything that's as a gift that Jesus is offering you, that is enough for you. In fact, anything outside of that is often a distraction for what Jesus really desires for you. So he's saying he is sufficient. There is not another way of living. There is not another religion, there's not other philosophy, not other way of thinking, not other ways of living. There is not, you could live completely selfish and for selfish ambition and for your own pleasures, but that will not lead to satisfaction and to completeness like Jesus. He is sufficient to meet every one of your needs, even the ones you don't even know you have. Even the ones that you don't even know exist. God is enough, and the gospel is enough for you. You need nothing else. Chapter 2, we brought up, Paul is right. Remember, he's writing this letter to a church, and he's saying, but be careful now that you know this, that God is supreme and he is enough. He says, don't be fooled and tricked by false arguments, by false theology, by false teachers. Don't become captured by arguments that sound really good. Or you know what, oh man, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, that tends to be where we live in our world right now, is it's kind of this, hey man, everybody's just on their own journey and you just kind of got to figure it out on your own. And I'd actually listened the other day and someone was talking about that truth is not solid, but that everybody has their own truth. Everybody's truth is a little bit different, which is so weird because it can't be true if it's not true across the board. You can't say, like, Mitch, what's 3 plus 3? 6. You can't all of a sudden go, well, I just don't feel like 3 plus 3 is 6. I feel like it's 7. Like, you don't get to do that. Truth is truth. So if everyone's view is different and everywhere, it's just the problem is everybody's living their own lie. Not everybody's living their own truth. And so he said, don't get caught up by that. The truth is what the truth is, and Christ is the truth. Says don't fall into that. And he says the only way you can keep from getting tripped up by that, the only way to not fall into the temptation of following either your own religion or other religions or other arguments, is to be founded and rooted in your word. Be rooted in your faith and established, meaning my head believes what the word of God says and my actions follow what the word of God says. Because here's the thing, we have a lot of believers who have no actions. We got a lot of people, if they were to check some check boxes on the survey and they say, yep, I'm a Christian. Say, do you pray? Not really. Do you go to church? Sometimes. Do you do acts of service as Christ has called you to do? No. Do you believe it's your responsibility to help spread the gospel and to teach people about Jesus? Oh, no, that's not me. We have a lot of people who believe in Jesus but don't follow Jesus. And so that's it. He says you have to be established in your faith. You have to actually walk it out. And when you do, that helps you when those plausible or believable arguments come in. You're like, no, that doesn't line up with what my head knows and my feet do. That's not going to work. Chapter 3, Pastor talked about it last week, but he said, put to death your worldliness. Put to death your worldliness and set your mind on things of heaven. Set your mind on things of heaven. It is so hard for us as humans to be heavenly minded. It's so hard because we don't see it yet. It's so hard because we're not there yet. Only thing you see is this around here. But Paul was challenging the Colossians to say, hey, I know there's a lot going on around, but put to death the actions of the world and begin to think on heavenly things. Begin to think of your eternal resting place. Begin to think of where you'll spend eternity, not where you'll spend in perspective, a very short amount of time here. So that was chapters 1, 2, and 3. Now, there is a section, if you've ever read through Colossians, there's a section right at the end of 3, and it wraps into the beginning of chapter 4. And this section is called the Rules for Christian Household. It discusses the roles of wives, husbands, children, fathers, workers, employers, slaves, and masters. I wanted to preach on this. I really did, because I looked and I go, this is so timely for us right now. But the more I studied, the more I realized that in our culture and in our context, there is a lot. If I look and I say, wives, submit to your husbands, that is a whole lot to unpack in our culture. Doesn't mean that God doesn't mean it, or that, but there's a lot to unpack to talk about what God is saying. And then to wrap it into husband, love your wives, and don't be harsh with them. That's a lot to unpack, and talking about how fathers should treat children. How about this? Kids, obey your parents. That's what it says. Are you doing it? Like, that's a lot to unpack. Why does that even matter? What's the importance of that? And I realized that there is absolutely no possible way that I could preach that message to you in 25, 35 minutes on one night. The more I study, the more I realize that is a series in its own, and I will do my due diligence to study it and one day try to squeeze a whole series out of Pastor and just be like, can I just have the stage for a few weeks? We'll see. So I'm not going to jump into that, and the other reason is because when we would miss out on the closing of Colossians, which if we're going to go through studying it, how does Paul end this letter? How does Paul, at the very end of everything he says, what's he going to wrap it up? And I wanted to make sure that we do that because it's a very short part, but it means a whole lot. It's a very short part, but it means a whole lot. So we're going to do that. Let's jump over to chapter 4, verse 2 through 6. Colossians chapter 4, verses 2 through 6. If you're there, say ready. If you're not, say not ready. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us that God may open us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account for which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Verse 5, walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. Everyone say seasoned with salt. It says, always be gracious and seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. When we look at the book of Colossians, we have to understand it in historical context, because you got to remember, this is a letter written to believers. So you have to understand that there are storylines that go on about that. What's going on in the church, what's going on around it. Like if right now Jesus wrote a letter to Bedford First Church of God, or say all the churches of Bedford, Indiana, it would probably begin to speak to us based on what's going on inside of our church. It would speak to us on what's going on outside. And how the political landscape, the health landscape, it would have all of that, and that would all be read knowing Paul knows what's going on, and so that's how you have to read it. So you have to look and understand the political and the cultural landscape of the Roman kingdom at the time. You have to understand that The Roman Empire is like no other empire ever in history. In the fact of how large the Roman Empire was, they basically conquered almost the entire known world. Like everything from England all the way to the other side of India, that was all the Roman Empire. And then they ruled it for 1,500 years. We're like 200 and something years into the US, and sometimes it feels like we're hanging on threads trying to keep everybody together. And they ruled for 1,500 years. But with this, Rome had defeated a lot of other countries, had defeated a lot of other empires. And with that, it began to mesh cultures together. Because the thing is Rome lived fairly peacefully for a long time. And that was as long as you didn't like go against Rome. As long as you didn't rebel against them. But that meant a lot of religions, especially in large metropolitan area, a lot of religions, a lot of cultures had been mixed together. Like there is really, it's hard for us to understand it because in Bedford, we're kind of just us. We're not a very diverse community, and that's a negative thing. It just simply is a fact. We're not very diverse. We don't have 30 different types of religions and temples and places of worship. We have a lot of Christian churches, but not very many others. We're not very diverse, but this metropolitan area would have been very diverse, lots of cultures mixing together. You would have started to live a little bit of their religious beliefs. They would have started to live a little bit of yours. Some of the cultural things you did would begin to wear off, almost like the melting pot, where everything just kind of comes together. So you have to understand that when Colossians was written, most of the book is about you as a believer and living differently. Because he first attacks he comes in and he attacks the mind of all the believers. He's like, listen, you guys, you got to understand that Christ is king and he is set up and he is over all. And then he begins to work down from your mind and into your heart and being able to be established in your faith. And then he talks about how you should live. The first 3 chapters are all about you. They're all about fixing you and changing you and adapting you to the way that Christ wants you to live. And the reason it's so focused on you and your behavior, again, not outward behavior, but head and heart, and then let it come from the outside, or come from the inside to the outside, and begin to change the way you behave and live. Even to the point that what we missed over was the rules for the Christian household. Everything was about changing the way that you think and live. And the reason was because there was such a mess of how everyone thought and believed. Such a mess. There's only one other place like that in Bedford, and that's a high school. Like, you take all of these people there. I promise you, what's weird about high school, and I didn't know you guys would be in here, but what's weird about high school and junior high is there's no other place in the world like it. No other place. No other place do you take that many people, shove them in that tight of quarters, and allow them to rub off on each other and change it. I mean, you got to admit, when you went to school, think about when you went to school. Some of you, it was a few years ago. Some of you, it was a few more. But when you went there, you begin to watch how other people live and do things. There's things that you did that you walk in and you're like, well, I ain't doing that no more because I'm going to stand out like a sore thumb. You know, there's things you would watch how other people dress, and that begins to affect the way you dress. You would dress a certain way, and it would affect other people in the way they dress, the way they talk, the way you talk. Everything happened, and it was a lot like that in this area. And so what happened was the Christians, they were struggling to look different than the culture because the culture had surrounded them and been so much a part of who they were. So that's why Colossians 1, 2, and 3 is so focused on changing you and saying you should live differently. You should be set apart. You should be different than the rest of the world. And so that's why we deal with that so much. But see, the church tends to historically have massive swings, like a pendulum. Like, you guys remember, when's the last time you got on a swing set? Like that idea, like I used to love the swing set. Especially like whenever you first started learning to like do the kick, and you're like out, in, out, and like you really get going, and you get too high and you get that tickle in your belly, and you're like that. You know what's funny is when you get older, that tickle in your belly ain't near as fun as it used to be. Like the other day, we were hanging out with my in-laws, and my brother-in-law, he started swinging, and he goes, I don't like this anymore, and he's like feeling queasy and stuff. That's how, like, this is what happens to the church, is we tend to have massive swings that make us sick. And so Paul, understanding that he is, at this point, the church has this, we tend to swing from secular to separate. We tend to swing from being very secular, meaning you very much look like the world, like you don't look a lot different than the world. It'd be hard for somebody to just walk by and go, yeah, I think, yeah, by the way you act and look and dress, you're a Christian. Definitely you're a Christian, and then, yeah, those aren't. We tend to, if you're secular, you tend to hardly be able to tell the difference, the way you live, talk, act, dress, everything, even the way you spend your time and your money tends to look very much just like the world around you. But then the church often gets convicted of that. First, they usually get condemned of that. Then they get convicted of that. And what happens is that pendulum begins to swing back to a change of living. And we begin to kind of like a holiness movement. And hey, I got to live different if I'm a follower of Christ. But what happens is we begin to keep swinging, and we go past that middle point, and we swing all the way up into where we now feel like we need to be separate from the world. We change so much about us, and then we get to the point where we live completely away from the world. Like, we don't live anything a part of it. We don't do anything they do. We don't have anything to do with them at all, because we want to make sure that our behavior and our actions stay on par with what Christ wants, and so we swing all the way to this side. Now, Paul knew that was coming because he had spent so much time trying to talk the Colossians out of being secular, out of looking like the world around you. And so in chapter 4, he begins to bring that up, because as a church, we always have a tendency to be like the world or run from it. We either want to be like the world or we want to run completely from it. And so Paul understands this and understands that that's coming. And so the closing of his letter, he begins to try to balance, like tries to stop the swing or slow it down so it spins, because the sweet spot is the middle. The sweet spot is right there where that pendulum meets at the bottom, where we live differently, but we still live in the world. And so he's trying to impede that, and he does that. He does that in chapter 4, and those verses that we read. He begins to remind us that it's not just all about you. He begins to remind us that our job is not to run from the world, but to run into the world. Like, it's weird, because often, like, it's always about not doing and not doing and not doing. But he's like, hey, let's change who you are. Let's change your heart, but now run towards the world. Let's run into the world. You got to remember that this is the commands of Jesus. When Jesus was praying, right before he ascends back into heaven, and in John 17, he's praying for all his disciples, for his followers. And he's talking to his Father, and he says, I do not ask that you take them out of this world, but deliver them from evil. He says, I don't want you to take my disciples out of this world. I don't want to send them up to heaven just yet. I just want to make sure that you watch over and protect them from the world, but I want them to go into the world. Because in Matthew 28, Jesus commands us. Everyone say command. If the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords commands something, we need to listen. He commands, go. Matthew 28, go, therefore, and make disciples. Go, therefore, and make disciples. He did not call us to build our little church walls and build our little church community and build up the walls and keep the world out. Don't let them ever talk to you. Don't be afraid. I knew a pastor. He grew up in an era that was very much separate. He was an older pastor at a place I worked. This was like 2015. If he went to the movies, he would drive 45 minutes to an hour to go to a movie theater. He'd pass by like 6 or 7 movie theaters just to go watch a movie. Because when he grew up, pastors and Christians did not go to the movie theater because they were evil and bad. It didn't matter what movie they were showing, that's where sinners go. You don't go there. So he still had that, even though years beyond that, and no one else was thinking that, he would still do that, because I just don't want to, get hung up. I don't want to get caught doing that. So he would drive just to go to a movie theater. Because there was just a time, again, the church always swings from this like incredibly like, man, you guys don't look like anything different than the world, to, man, you guys have nothing to do with the world. So he begins to realize that happens, but yet Jesus tells us to go into the world. To go into the world. Yes, protect us from the evil, but go into the world. If we look at those verses that we read earlier in chapter 4, let's break them down a little bit. 2 through 4, it says this: continue steadfastly in prayer. Everybody say prayer. It says, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open us a door for the word, to declare the mystery of Christ on account for which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Paul begins to transition from telling these people that your behavior and your actions should look different, to let go of the worldliness and take on a holy way of living. And now he's saying, now he starts to flip and he says, but also pray for me because I still want to advance the mystery of the gospel. There are people that have never heard the story of Jesus, and I, Paul, want to go and do that. So will you, church, pray for me to open those doors, and that you would pray for me to have words to speak, that I could speak clearly, not meaning without stuttering, but meaning that I could speak clearly to each different mind the way that they need to hear the gospel, because everyone's at a different starting place. He says, pray for me to do that. And he's doing this because he wants you to transition from thinking just about yourself. And he says, while you're working on yourself, also remember to pray for me because there's still others out there as well. And so he's praying and said, hey, when in your prayers, be thinking about the lost and how I can help reach them. But then he shifts, and no longer is it about praying for me to go and do something. He immediately, in verse 5, switches it back to how you should think too, or how you should act in that. He goes to verse 5 and he says, walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. He switched it from pray for me, pray for me, pray for me, to now he's saying, and now you go into the outside. You go see outsiders. And by outsiders, it just simply means those that can't call God Father and Christ Lord. It's just those that are not believers in Christ. He says, those are the outsiders. Go towards them. Church, we got to get to a place where we are walking towards outsiders. You are absolutely called to live different than the world. You are absolutely called to drop your worldliness down and to put your mind on heavenly things. But we have to understand that we have to be in the world. We have to be intentional about going towards outsiders. Because Christ called you to change, but you have to understand that changed people change people. Changed people change people. If you have been changed, then you are going to be a catalyst into helping others change through the gospel. By your testimony, by your life, by your actions, by your words. We have to be intentional about going. And I mean, this gets hard because I'm like, how do you do that? And so I'm just gonna name a few examples that came into the top of my head, but I think for each one of you, you might see it differently of how you can enter into your world intentionally. Everything from hanging out with your neighbors. Like neighbors down the street, they invite you over to the barbecue and you're like, I don't know if I should go there. Old Billy, he knocks back a few beers every time we go there, and Susan drinks 2 boxes of wine. I don't know if we should go over there. That's exactly where you need to be. It's exactly where you need to be. You have to be in the world. We have to be an impact in the world. Maybe it's hanging out with your neighbors. Maybe it's golf with the buddies, or golf with the ladies, or golfing with a couple. Going out there and just laughing and having a good time and being with them. And being able to be you and all that Christ has done in you, but being with them. Because that's the thing, like I think it's, I am not condemning this. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But I do think it's funny that we have church league softball. They have a city league, and what does the church do? Hey, let's get the churches together, and we'll come play over here. We'll play over here because that way we don't have to hear them cuss. And they're also usually better than us, and they beat us really bad. And again, I'm not knocking church leagues. Okay, yes, I am. But I'm not saying it's bad, but it tends to be the way we drift. We create our own little things so that we can be good, but we forget that that's one of the best places to be, is be the best stinking shortstop in the league for Jesus. In fat man softball, like you know, done with high school and college. Like, you can be great out there and have fun and laugh and still represent Christ well. In fact, so much better. I mean, the truth is, church league softball, it's almost like, hey, you Christian, I'm a Christian. Okay, then we'll yell and cuss at each other because I don't have to worry about my witness. Yeah, but we do silly things like that, and we miss out on our opportunities to be. So go out and enjoy entertainment with outsiders. And I'm not saying like, you're my mission, you're my project. Go and enjoy them as people, as God's future children, as the people that God loves. Pray that you have the eyes of God to see people the way that he sees them. I mean, it could be book clubs, and it doesn't have to be Christian books. It could just be book clubs that you go and enjoy and sit. It could be crafting time. You and the guys get together, whip up some crafts, maybe do some crochet. I don't know. And then again, this is hard for me because I don't even necessarily know how to do it, because I was for the longest time, I felt like I was always told to separate myself from the world. Don't be in the world. And yet when I read the scriptures, it's more just don't be like the world, but go into it. We often want to scream at the community and tell us, come to church, come to church, come to church, come to church, and yet we won't do anything with them. We can't be afraid of that. Let's go do it. Let's go be. It could be, I love when you begin to see people in the church, they're on committees that are with maybe some community projects. They're on boards and councils and with community. I love that. Maybe you're involved in low-level politics of being in there. And those are all really good things. To be in the world, to go towards the outside, not from, go towards the outsiders. To be intentional with that. We need to be active in your community. And I live in a world now that I realize that there is even an online world. There is a digital world, a virtual world. And I wish I could stand up here and say, yeah, you could do this, do this. I'm like stupid when it comes to that, and so I kind of just drift away. But I don't want to shut it off like that's not real. There is a virtual world that you can be in. There is a social media world that you can be in, that you can dive in, and you can make a strong impact there. Now, before you go out and kick back a case of beers with your buddy because Chase said so, you know, I didn't get an amen all service. I got nothing, but I get it to that. Before you go do that, remember what he said in the very beginning. He said, walk in wisdom towards outsiders. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders. If you go out with your golf buddies and like you come back and you don't remember anything, you wake up the next morning and you got a new tattoo, and a new wife, it's probably not a good idea for that to be the way you socialize with the world. If every time you go and hang out with your friends or with your neighbors or with a group of people and you just begin to become a part of the gossip of the community, or they begin to bash their husband and talk about how annoying he is, and you're like, yeah, mine too, or maybe, I'm tired of my spouse. Yeah, the old ball and chain. If all your conversation begins to lean towards a negative side, then that is not the way that God is calling you to go. It says, go in wisdom into the world. Go to a place and that's not going to hurt the gospel in your life, nor the gospel in their life that's coming to fruition. So you have to be wise, and everybody deals with different things. So you gotta be, like, there's people that they're like, yeah, I can play softball, but all of a sudden they're playing on 6 different nights. They never see their family again because they're trying to go pro in softball. That might be a way you wanna step back from that one and say, yeah, that one can't be for me because I can't also, like playing tournaments during church. At some point you're like, well, what's going on here? You have to be wise, and that's why as somebody up here talking, I can't tell you what that is. We live in we talked about it earlier. We live in black and white. There are places in the Bible that are black and white, but there are places that are gray. And God gives you wisdom for those. There are places that Diane, that you can go that I can't. I can't go because it's gonna lead me to a place where I become negative, or I slander, or I gossip. But you could go and be a light and a strength to that. Doesn't take me out of my role and responsibility to be in the world. It just depends on where do I do that. So it says, be wise. It says, making the best use of your time. You have to understand you're only here for a little bit. You're only here for a little. I know sometimes it feels like, man, you're 20, 21, 22, maybe 31, 32, and it just feels like you have forever. But you don't. And as Christ came and saved us and put us on mission, whether you're 17 or 77, you are on mission. You are here for a purpose to advance the kingdom of God. And it says you have such a short time. Make good use of it. Don't hide behind the walls, and don't foolishly go out there and live. But be intentional with what you're doing with your life. One of the ways that I can think is to, one, you may have heard the phrase, you're not home yet. This is not your home. Your home is heaven. This is not You do not have citizenship of this place anymore. Your citizenship is in heaven. So how you should view your time here on earth is like a soldier deployed. When you think you have soldiers go, they leave our country, they get shipped out on airplane or on boat, they go to other countries. Their mission is not to go and get really comfy in that country, become a citizen of that country, try to live like that country, try to look like that country, adopt everything else about that country. Their job is to go in with their mission, and when that mission is finished, then they get to come home. Whether it's finished completely or finished for them, when they've done their part, then they come home, and then they get to, I mean, how many, you get soldiers come in and like the first thing they do is they run to like that favorite restaurant. They're like, oh my God, I haven't had In-N-Out in so long. Sorry, California reference. Nobody gets that. Like, man, man, I'm so happy to be home and sit on my mom's couch. This is my favorite. I'm so happy to sleep in my bed. Because they're home. Their mission wasn't, when they were on mission, they weren't trying to set up a new home somewhere else. They did what they needed to do, and then when it was their time, they came home. If we as believers of Christ could remember that we are simply deployed here and that our home is in heaven. Like, how many of you guys like to be happy? How many like to be happy? How many of you guys like to, like, comfort? Like things, like comfortable things. Like, man, it just makes me feel comfortable. I promise you, you will have all those at home. You will have all the comforts of home. You will have all the happiness and the satisfaction. You'll have that at home. But you may not have it here, but that's not our mission here. Our mission is to go towards the world and win them with the gospel, the same gospel that won us. Lastly, and then we'll close on this right here, verse 6. It says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. When it says, let your words be gracious, it kind of alludes to what I've been talking about. Don't go into the world if the way you talk is going to ruin the gospel. And I'm not talking about cuss words and things, not that we should cuss like Navy sailors or anything, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just the way that we talk. Our voice should carry confidence. Our voice should carry joy. Our voice should bring encouragement to others, not bring down. It shouldn't be where all we do is complain about the government. All we do is complain about rules. All we do is complain about what's going on in the world. It shouldn't be we just complain about what's going on at home and all that. It shouldn't be that way. We should speak graciously. It's almost like the rule you always grew up hearing. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. It's that kind of idea. Let our words be gracious. Man, you might be out there golfing with the buddies, and they're just, cutting up, crude, all that. Doesn't mean that you're like this prude stuck in the corner like, well, I'm not golfing with you guys. But it doesn't mean you got to jump in either, and it doesn't mean that you can't continue to speak gracious and encouragement and bring life and joy into that group or whatever group you're in. Speak gracious. But what I love, it says seasoned with salt. If the first part is telling you to speak gracious, that's telling you to guard your tongue. Guard your tongue. Don't let it just say anything at once. But then it also says, be seasoned with salt. It also means to not just guard your tongue, but be intentional with your words. I can tell you what, I could go play on a softball team right now, and they're probably never gonna hear me cuss. I could go the whole season and just be the positive, uplifting guy, like, you got it, bud, you got a good hit. I know we got beat by 47, but good job, we had fun, right? Not fun. I could be that guy, and I could speak graciously, but I could go the whole season and never mention Jesus. I could go the whole season and never offer prayer to anyone. I could go the whole season and never encourage somebody to say, have you ever thought about eternity? Have you ever thought about what happened? Or somebody's complaining or struggling at work, and I don't offer anything about Jesus. Let your words be gracious, so guard your tongue, but also be intentional and realize that you don't just go out in the world just to be. But God wants to use you, and he wants to season your conversation with him. And that doesn't mean all the time, because I don't know if you've ever met those people that just shove it down your throat all the time, and you're like, you make me not want to be a believer. I've had people pray for me. Out in public places, I'm walking up and like trying to go to a movie, and this group comes up to me and like, hey, can I pray for you? Do you know Jesus? And I'm like, I do, actually. I go to church over here. Well, let me just pray for you anyways. And they just go, and I'm like, I don't want to be associated with you. You're converting me the wrong way. It doesn't mean just shove, it just means know when you need to say something and be willing to do it. Let your conversations, as you do go into the world, teens, adults, and everywhere in between, as we go into a world, guard your tongue, but also let it be seasoned with Jesus. Know when it's time to invite Jim to come to church. Know when it's time to say, hey, Susan, I hear you complaining all the time about your marriage and you're really struggling with that and all that. Have you ever thought that maybe if you allowed Christ to come in and change your heart, that could actually affect your marriage? And that's not an easy thing to say, and it's not an easy time, but be aware of what the Spirit's doing and know when to sprinkle it with salt.